Usually when we talk about the structure of global power, there is this comforting expectation of permanence.
Right.
It's like looking at a massive ancient piece of architecture. You look at international alliances or global trade routes, decades-old peace treaties, and you just assume the foundation is solid rock.
Yeah. You expect it to hold the weight of the world.
Exactly, no matter what happens on the surface. But then you encounter a scenario where the geopolitical tectonic plates just start violently shifting underneath.
And suddenly that solid rock looks a lot more like crumbling sandstone.
Yeah, exactly. And today we are bringing you an analysis that examines exactly that kind of structural collapse. We're analyzing a really high-stakes geopolitical breakdown, stalled international negotiations, and a domestic political divide that seems to be paralyzing the government right at the exact moment it's needed most. We are just thrilled you are here with us for this exploration.
It is an incredibly complex exploration for sure. And before we really get going, we do need to establish one quick essential ground rule for you.
Right, very important.
The political commentary we're analyzing today, which comes from a recent video source, is highly polarized. I mean, it features intense partisan language and some really severe criticisms of current United States leadership.
It definitely does.
So our mission today is strictly analytical. We are acting as neutral guides to decode the arguments and the factual claims presented. We are not here to take sides, endorse the rhetoric, or validate any partisan framing.
Perfectly stated.
Yeah, we're just here to break down the mechanics of the crisis being described.
We are looking at the machinery of these claims, not cheering for a team. So, looking at the international stage, the source outlines a diplomatic crisis unfolding in real time in Islamabad, Pakistan. And the immediate picture painted is one of just complete diplomatic gridlock.
Total gridlock.
The United States has sent a delegation, led by J.D. Vance, to negotiate a ceasefire with Iran. But the Iranian lead negotiators are reportedly refusing to even show up to the meetings.
Yeah, the term ghosting comes to mind, but, on a severe geopolitical scale. The practical reality being described is that Iran is refusing to engage in any dialogue until the United States agrees to negotiate strictly within the parameters of a specific 10-point framework.
And the political controversy ignites because the commentary asserts that the U.S. president had previously stated publicly that he was agreeable to this 10-point plan.
Yeah, treating it as the foundational basis for a settlement.
So the U.S. delegation flies halfway across the world, sits down at the table, and the other side essentially says, well, we aren't talking until you formally concede to the terms you already conceded to in public.
Which is a massive flex of leverage.
It really is. But before we even break down the details of those 10 points, we need to look at the location itself. The U.S. selected Pakistan's leadership, specifically Prime Minister Sharif and Defense Minister Khawaja Asif, to act as the mediators for this incredibly delicate negotiation.
And the choice of mediator is often just as critical as the negotiation itself.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, in any high-stakes diplomatic mediation, the neutrality, the public posture, and the underlying leverage of the mediator are what maintain the trust of both parties. You really need a broker who can impartially pressure both sides.
Oh, the text points out a glaring contradiction here. While the U.S. delegation is sitting in Islamabad waiting for the Iranians to show up, the chosen mediator, the Pakistani defense minister, is publicly posting messages stating that Israel must be restrained in order for any U.S.-Iran ceasefire to hold.
The diplomatic friction that creates is just profound.
Yet.
The expert commentary highlights the strategic vulnerability of this dynamic. Consider the architecture of this setup for a second. The United States hand-selects mediator to bridge the gap with an adversary.
Okay.
That mediator then turns around and publicly places the entire burden of restraint on a primary U.S. ally, Israel, as a precondition for peace.
It essentially signals to Iran that the mediator is already adopting their framing of the conflict.
Exactly. The source argues this shows the administration's diplomatic strategy is, well, chaotic. It suggests they completely misjudged the priorities of the very people they asked to manage the crisis.
Yeah, when your mediator publicly critiques your ally while your adversary refuses to enter the room, your negotiating position is severely compromised before a single word is spoken.
It sets an impossible stage. But let's look at the actual framework causing this deadlock, the
Yeah.
10-point plan.
Right, let's get into that.
The source details these conditions, and to fully grasp why the commentator labels this a surrender, we have to break down the mechanics of what the source claims the president agreed to as a workable baseline.
Okay, lay it out for us.
Well, the list is sweeping. First, the removal of all United States forces and military bases from the Middle East entirely.
Wait, let's pause right there. Removal of all U.S. forces. That isn't just like packing up a few tents. What does the U.S. footprint actually look like in the Middle East?
It's a massive, highly integrated logistical network. We are talking about tens of thousands of personnel spread across multiple countries.
Wow.
Air Force bases in Qatar, naval fleets in Bahrain, troop deployments in Iraq and Syria, radar installations, and intelligence hubs.
So removing all of that doesn't just mean withdrawing troops.
No, it means dismantling a multi-billion-dollar infrastructure that has served as the backbone of regional security and global power projection for decades. It leaves a total vacuum.
And vacuums always get filled,
Yeah.
usually by the adversary. Okay, what is the second point?
Second, an agreement by the U.S. and its allies, explicitly including Israel, to never attack Iran or its proxy terror forces again.
Which raises the immediate question of how you even define a proxy.
Right.
I mean, if a group like Hezbollah in Lebanon or the Houthis in Yemen launch an attack and the U.S. has agreed never to strike back at them or their Iranian sponsors, you are essentially granting blanket immunity to asymmetric warfare.
Yeah, you are telling an adversary they can strike you without consequence as long as they use a middleman.
That's incredible.
And that is the precise strategic concern the source is highlighting. So, moving to the third point, the lifting of all primary and secondary sanctions on Iran.
I want to dig into the mechanics of this because we hear the word sanctions thrown around constantly in the news, but the difference between primary and secondary is really crucial here. Explain how these actually function for us.
Sure. Primary sanctions are straightforward. They prohibit United States citizens and U.S. companies from doing business with Iran. It is a direct embargo.
Okay.
Secondary sanctions, however, are where the true economic leverage lies. Secondary sanctions essentially force the rest of the world to make a choice.
Like an ultimatum.
Exactly. The U.S. government tells foreign banks, foreign shipping companies, and foreign corporations, you can do business with Iran, or you can do business with the United States financial system, but you cannot do both.
And because the U.S. dollar is the global reserve currency and the U.S. economy is so massive, almost every international bank or corporation will choose the U.S. over Iran.
Right. Secondary sanctions are what actually strangle an adversary's economy because it weaponizes global access. Lifting both primary and secondary sanctions means Iran can immediately reintegrate into the global financial system.
They can sell their oil freely on the open market,
Yes, and access international banking without restriction.
which basically floods their economy with cash. And speaking of cash, the fourth point is the unfreezing of all overseas property held by Iranian leaders.
This refers to billions of dollars in sovereign wealth and leadership assets that have been locked in international escrow accounts due to those very sanctions.
So unfreezing them provides an immediate, massive capital injection to the regime.
Exactly.
Then we hit the fifth point, which honestly made me stop reading and reread the text.
I know the one you mean.
The payment of war reparations by the United States to Iran. War reparations. Usually, reparations are paid by the loser of a formalized, declared war to the victor. Agreeing to pay reparations in a diplomatic negotiation where you haven't even fought a direct, formal war, I mean, what is the precedent for that?
Well, the commentator argues there is no modern precedent for a superpower voluntarily paying reparations to a regional adversary without suffering total military defeat.
It's just a staggering concession.
It is. By agreeing to pay reparations, the U.S. would effectively be accepting legal and moral culpability for the conflict, framing their own prior foreign policy as unlawful aggression. It is an admission of guilt that carries massive international legal implications.
It completely flips the narrative of who the aggressor is. Okay, point 6. This one has profound economic implications for everyone listening. The plan allegedly allows Iran to completely control the Strait of Hormuz,
Yes.
including the right to charge a $2 million transit fee for every single ship that passes through it.
Right. And point 7 allows Iran to keep all of its ballistic missiles and drone fleets. Finally, the plan maintains total silence on the issue of nuclear enrichment. In fact, the source claims the text of the plan literally says enriched uranium is permitted.
Okay, I have to step back and look at the underlying logic of this from a purely mechanical negotiation standpoint. The commentator calls it a capitulation, but let's break down why. If you are entering a negotiation, you usually start with your absolute ideal scenario.
Yeah, yes.
And you compromise toward the middle. If the U.S. is starting the negotiation by accepting a baseline that kicks them out of the region, grants immunity to proxies, removes all economic leverage, pays reparations, gives up a global shipping choke point, and allows nuclear enrichment, what exactly is the U.S. getting in return?
According to the perspective presented in the source, the U.S. is getting absolutely nothing in return except a temporary, localized ceasefire.
Oh.
The commentator argues there is no strategic logic here. If you agree to these terms, even as a baseline, you are signaling to the adversary that you have completely lost your leverage, or worse, that you lack the political will to use the leverage you actually have.
Yeah, the source features an interview with a Democratic congressman, Jake Auchincloss, who explicitly calls this document a wish list that previous Iranian leaders could only have dreamed of. This is like if you're buying a house and the seller says you have to pay double, waive all inspections, and let them keep living in the basement, why would you agree?
Exactly. But the administration isn't just owning this massive list of concessions, right? The source points out they are actively trying to walk it back.
Yes.
The commentary details the administration's current defense, which hinges on a claim of massive miscommunication.
Oh, boy.
The argument coming from the president's camp is that Iran's parliament leader, MB Ghalibaf, doesn't speak English well. Because of this language barrier, the administration claims things were lost in translation.
Lost in translation.
They are now asserting that they actually accepted a 15-point plan, not the 10-point plan that was publicly posted and celebrated by Iran.
I find this defense utterly fascinating from a logistical standpoint. How exactly does a highly trained diplomatic corps, utilizing professional translators, lose 5 entire points of a geopolitical framework in translation?
It's a fair question.
We aren't talking about mistranslating a colloquial phrase. We are talking about the presence or absence of massive geopolitical concessions.
The source is incredibly critical of this defense, characterizing it as a pathetic clown show. The logistical reality is that high-level diplomatic texts are usually drafted, translated, retranslated, and scrutinized by teams of linguists and legal experts on both sides before anyone publicly agrees to them.
Right, there are layers of checks.
The commentator argues that Iran intentionally laid a trap.
Explain that trap mechanism. How does publicly posting a misunderstood document benefit Iran if they know the U.S. will just deny it later?
Because the damage is in the anchoring. Iran knew the U.S. president might breach the agreement or try to backtrack, but simply getting the U.S. administration to publicly validate those 10 points in the first place, even vaguely, achieved their primary goal. It inflicted a massive blow to U.S. credibility.
Because it broadcasts to the world that these extreme demands are now within the realm of realistic possibility.
Precisely. This highlights a crucial concept in international relations: signaling. The source's argument is that the structural damage is already done.
The toothpaste is out of the tube.
Exactly. Even if these 10 points never become an instantiated, ratified international treaty, because as the source notes, Congress and international allies would absolutely revolt, these 10 points have now become the new anchor point for regional power dynamics. The message broadcasted to the rest of the world is that American resolve has yielded.
And that yielding has immediate, tangible consequences that cascade down to you, the listener. If the international strategy is completely deadlocked and credibility is damaged, the physical realities of global trade become incredibly vulnerable. This leads us directly to the massive disconnect the source highlights between the administration's public rhetoric and their private realities, especially concerning the Strait of Hormuz.
To understand the severity of this, we have to look at the geography of the Strait of Hormuz. It is one of the most critical maritime choke points on the planet, particularly for the global oil supply.
Okay, set the scene for us.
It connects the Persian Gulf to the Gulf of Oman and the open ocean. At its narrowest point, the strait is only about 21 miles wide, but the actual shipping lanes that deepwater oil tankers can use are only 2 miles wide in either direction.
2 miles wide. That is incredibly narrow when you are dealing with massive commercial vessels.
Highly restricted.
And the source presents a stark contrast in how the administration is handling this choke point. Publicly, the president is making sweeping assurances. He is saying that the Strait of Hormuz is open, that oil will flow again quickly, and he is projecting total control over the situation.
But privately, according to the provided text, the situation is entirely different. The source claims the president is privately confiding to his cabinet and White House staff that he genuinely doubts the strait will ever fully reopen in the near future.
Wow, that's a huge shift in tone.
He is reportedly becoming highly anxious that Iran is never going to relinquish the control he allegedly conceded to them in that 10-point framework.
We need to unpack how a $2 million toll actually works in practice, because this isn't like a toll booth on a highway where you toss in a few coins. If Iran decides they control the strait and imposes a $2 million fee per ship, how do they physically enforce that?
Enforcement in maritime choke points relies on naval interdiction. Iran would use its fast attack boats, naval vessels, and coastal missile batteries to threaten any ship that attempts to pass without paying.
And if they don't pay?
If a ship refuses, they board it, seize the vessel, detain the crew, and impound the cargo.
Which instantly fundamentally alters the calculus for global shipping companies.
Completely. Because the moment a waterway is deemed a high-risk conflict zone where ships are being boarded or extorted, international maritime insurance premiums managed by entities like Lloyd's of London skyrocket. Sometimes insurers will simply refuse to cover vessels passing through the area at all.
And if a ship can't get insurance, it doesn't sail. Or it is forced to take a massive detour, sailing thousands of additional miles around the entire continent in Africa to reach Europe or the Americas.
Both scenarios.
Yeah.
Paying a $2 million extortion fee or adding weeks of travel time and fuel costs to sail around Africa result in the exact same outcome.
A massive increase in the cost of shipping. And this is where the geopolitical abstraction becomes a harsh reality for your wallet. A toll of that magnitude, or the resulting insurance spikes, act as a massive global tax. It trickles down instantly. It impacts the cost of raw materials, the price of the energy you use to heat your home, the cost of gas for your car, and even the price of the plastic packaging on the food at your local grocery store. It is a massive inflationary shockwave driven by a loss of geographic control.
And in response to this loss of control and the stalled negotiations, the source highlights the administration's escalating rhetoric.
Right.
The president reportedly stated that the U.S. is loading ships with, quote, the best ammunition, the best weapons ever made, and threatened that if a deal isn't reached, they will be used very effectively.
A very strong statement.
He also publicly dismissed Iran's leverage, posting that Iran has no cards to play other than what he called a short-term extortion of the world by using international waterways.
I really struggle with the logic of that statement. Calling the control of the Strait of Hormuz short-term extortion seems to completely misunderstand the permanence of geography. I mean, they aren't holding a building hostage, they are sitting on the valve of the global economy. How is this rhetoric landing with the Iranians?
Well, according to the source, this tough talk is completely backfiring. The commentary points out that the Iranian negotiating team is essentially laughing off these threats.
Really?
Their reported response to the weapons threats is essentially, keep talking like that. We control the strait, we hold the cards, and we are not showing up to Islamabad.
It is basic game theory. If you make a massive threat, but your opponent knows you just offered them a 10-point capitulation plan a week prior, your threat has zero credibility.
The source's perspective is that the president's past business bankruptcies are being mirrored in his diplomatic approach. It is characterized as bluster without underlying leverage. When you threaten an adversary who believes they have already won the structural negotiation, it only causes them to dig their heels in further and refuse to compromise at all.
So we have deadlocked negotiations, escalating empty rhetoric, and the global economy held hostage. But the fallout of this perceived weakness isn't contained to just U.S.-Iran relations. The source describes a terrifying domino effect spreading across the entire Middle East.
This brings us back to that structural collapse we discussed at the beginning. To understand the panic happening in the region right now, we have to look at the architecture of the American security umbrella.
Okay, let's look at that.
For decades, following World War II, the United States has maintained this umbrella over its allies in the Middle East.
How does that umbrella actually function? It is sort of an abstract term.
Functionally, it is a network of mutual defense assurances, weapons sales, intelligence sharing, and physical troop presence. The underlying arrangement, which the source commentator highly critically refers to as a quid pro quo or pay-for-play setup, is that Arab nations allied with the U.S. relied on the overwhelming dominance of the American military to deter regional threats.
Primarily the threat of an expansionist Iran.
Exactly. The Arab states align with U.S. interests, and in return, the U.S. ensures no one invades them.
But the source argues that these Arab nations are now watching this crisis unfold in real time. They see the U.S. potentially allowing Iran to control the Strait of Hormuz. They see the details of the 10-point plan, which explicitly calls for the removal of all U.S. forces. And their logical conclusion, according to the text, is that the American security umbrella is collapsing.
And if you are a regional power and the superpower deterrent suddenly vanishes, your calculus for survival changes overnight. The source highlights a terrifying implication. These former U.S. allies are now considering their own independent military interventions.
Because if the U.S. won't protect them, they have to preemptively protect themselves.
Exactly. When a centralized hegemon leaves a region, it creates a massive power vacuum. If individual nations start taking preemptive or reactive military action based on their own immediate, localized survival calculations, rather than a coordinated alliance strategy, the risk of miscalculations skyrockets.
It's a powder keg.
You risk triggering a chaotic, multi-front regional arms race and subsequent war. The source explicitly warns that an entire Middle East war could break out very soon as a direct result of this perceived U.S. capitulation.
And we don't even have to look to the future to see the violence this destabilization causes. It is happening right now. The source brings up the situation in Lebanon to illustrate this point. While the U.S. delegation sits waiting in a hotel in Pakistan, Israel has explicitly stated there is no ceasefire with Lebanon.
The text provides a grim statistic to underscore the severity of the violence occurring concurrently with these stalled negotiations. It references a recent massacre in Lebanon where 258 innocent people were killed and over 1,000 others suffered casualties.
It is a devastating human detail. The source uses it to paint a vivid picture of a region spinning rapidly out of control. The structural deterrence has failed, and the human cost is mounting by the hour while U.S. leadership flounders on the diplomatic stage.
So if the international strategy is deadlocked in Islamabad and the region is on the brink of wider war, you would logically assume that the domestic government in Washington, D.C. is working around the clock to find a solution, consolidate power, and manage the crisis.
You would hope so.
But looking at the source's next major point, the exact opposite is happening.
This is the part of the source material that really highlights the depth of the dysfunction. We have a collapsing ceasefire, threats of a multi-front Middle East war, global shipping lanes being choked off, and an ongoing partial shutdown of the federal government itself. So what is the United States House of Representatives doing to manage this historic convergence of crises? According to the source, they packed up and went home.
Yeah, the commentary notes that the House of Representatives has adjourned for a multi-day recess. The commentator points out messages posted from the House gallery confirming that lawmakers are completely away from legislative business during this critical period.
The optics of that are staggering.
They really are.
The source heavily criticizes the Speaker of the House, using a highly partisan nickname, and his party accusing them of, quote-unquote, refusing to show up and do their job. The accusation is that they're taking vacations while allowing unlawful wars to proceed unmanaged. But what is truly fascinating here isn't just the fact that they left. It is the philosophical, legal argument some members of Congress are making to justify their absence to the public.
Yes, the source includes a specific quote from a representative, Russell Fry, who offers a defense of Congress stepping back from the crisis.
What's his reasoning?
Representative Fry argues that Congress should not be micromanaging a war. He compares the situation to a corporate structure, stating that it doesn't make sense to micromanage the president with 535 CEOs.
535 CEOs.
He further defends the president's actions by characterizing the Middle East conflict not as a war, but as a limited incursion. He argues that the president is just going in to take care of business and fix things, and therefore doesn't need congressional interference or oversight.
Okay, I have to push back incredibly hard on that framing. And this requires us to look at the bedrock of American law. Describing the legislative branch as 535 CEOs trying to micromanage completely misrepresents the fundamental intentional structure of the United States government. The framers of the Constitution were terrified of a single executive having unilateral power to plunge the nation into war.
Which is why, under Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, the power to declare war is explicitly and exclusively vested in Congress.
Exactly. It is not micromanagement. It is literally their primary constitutional duty regarding armed conflict. The president is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, which means he directs the military once a war is authorized, but he does not have the constitutional authority to unilaterally initiate sustained conflicts.
The rhetorical strategy being employed by the representative here is fascinating to analyze. By labeling the conflict a limited incursion rather than a war, he is attempting to exploit a legal gray area. He is trying to place the military action solely under the president's inherent Article 2 authority to defend the nation, thereby sidestepping the War Powers Resolution of 1973.
Remind us how the War Powers Resolution functions in this context.
The War Powers Resolution was passed after the Vietnam War to check the president's power. It essentially states that the president can send troops into action abroad, but he must notify Congress within 48 hours, and forces cannot remain engaged for more than 60 days without congressional authorization or a formal declaration of war.
Got it.
So, by calling it a limited incursion to fix things, the representative is arguing that the threshold for congressional involvement hasn't been met. The source views this argument as a dangerous abdication of congressional responsibility and a blatant violation of the spirit of Article 1.
It is surrendering constitutional authority to avoid political accountability. And the source dives even deeper into the blame game and deflection tactics happening among lawmakers. When faced with the disastrous details of the 10-point plan and the immediate crisis in the Strait of Hormuz, instead of addressing the current administration's actions, some politicians are actively deflecting the narrative.
The commentary provides two highly distinct examples of this rhetorical strategy. First, it quotes a senator, McCormick, who attempts to reframe the crisis entirely by asking the public to participate in a thought experiment.
A thought experiment during an active global crisis. What is the premise?
He asks the public to imagine how much worse the situation would be if the Vice President Kamala Harris were currently in charge. He asks people to picture a hypothetical scenario where, under her leadership, Iran was allowed to spend 3 years building up its missile capabilities closer to a nuclear weapon. He calls that hypothetical world completely unacceptable.
The source host heavily criticizes this approach, calling it sociopath stuff. But impartially analyzing the rhetoric, the senator is utilizing a classic political deflection tactic. He is trying to divert attention from a current, tangible crisis by inventing a hypothetical future crisis under the opposing party and arguing that the hypothetical scenario is the real danger.
The inherent flaw in this tactic, which the source points out, is that it requires the listener to ignore the current reality.
Right.
The senator's hypothetical nightmare is that Iran builds up its missile capabilities.
Yeah.
But the source notes that under the actual current 10-point plan being discussed, Iran is explicitly allowed to keep all of its ballistic missiles and drone fleets anyway. He is manufacturing a hypothetical fear that mirrors the reality he's currently ignoring.
It is a massive intellectual dodge. And then you have another senator, Rick Scott, who takes a completely different but equally fascinating rhetorical approach regarding international allies, specifically in Europe.
Senator Scott's argument centers on the concept of historical debt. In the provided clip, he argues that European nations owe the United States absolute compliance in the current Iran situation because American service members saved their butts in the Second World War. He claims that without the U.S. intervention in the 1940s, Europe would all be speaking German today.
He is literally using a war from 80 years ago to demand current military cooperation in the Middle East. Let's break down the mechanics of international alliances, because this isn't how NATO works, right?
Correct. Modern military alliances like NATO are built on mutual defense treaties regarding specific geographic areas and specific conditions, like Article 5, where an attack on one is an attack on all. They're not built on perpetual transactional debts from past centuries.
Yeah, that's not how geopolitics functions.
Senator Scott argues that it is foolish for Europe not to support U.S. actions in Iran, and he complains bitterly that European allies are not allowing the U.S. to freely use military bases on their soil, bases that he notes American taxpayer dollars helped build.
But building a base in a sovereign country doesn't mean you own the country's foreign policy.
Exactly. And he goes even further. The senator explicitly threatens the very foundation of the alliance, stating that NATO is going to have to change, and questioning why the United States is even involved in the alliance if European partners aren't stepping up to support this specific unilateral American action against Iran.
So let's look at the full picture of the domestic political landscape presented in the source.
Yeah.
You have one side of the political spectrum shutting down Congress during a crisis. You have representatives calling their own constitutional war powers micromanagement. You have senators inventing hypothetical scenarios to blame the political opposition. And you have lawmakers threatening to dismantle NATO because European nations won't fall in line based on a blood debt from World War II.
It's a lot.
It paints a picture of profound systemic domestic dysfunction that perfectly mirrors the international chaos.
And observing this massive dual-front collapse of both international leverage and domestic governance leads us to the final major section of the source material. The commentary doesn't just present the crisis and leave it there. It presents a comprehensive, proposed strategic alternative.
Who is presenting this alternative?
This alternative vision is articulated by Representative Jake Auchincloss, a Democratic congressman and a Marine veteran.
The source relies heavily on his perspective, and his background is crucial context here. As a Marine captain who actually led teams in highly complex, difficult areas, his critique carries a specific operational weight. He isn't just a theoretician. And Representative Auchincloss does not mince words regarding the current administration's actions.
His assessment of the situation is incredibly severe. He categorizes the current breakdown not just as a policy failure, but as a generational loss. He states that the current president is now the first in American history to start and then lose a war completely by himself.
Start and lose a war by himself. That is a staggering historical claim. He is arguing that by circumventing Congress, initiating conflict, and then capitulating to the 10-point plan, the president has unilaterally engineered a defeat.
And Auchincloss goes even further, arguing that this specific outcome fundamentally signals the end of the post-World War II structural order. He argues that the era of Pax Americana has ended.
Let's define Pax Americana for a second, because it is central to his argument.
Pax Americana translates to American peace. It refers to the concept of relative peace in the Western Hemisphere and later globally, resulting from the preponderance of power enjoyed by the United States starting around the middle of the 20th century. It is the idea that American military and economic dominance acts as the ultimate stabilizing force, enforcing global rules, securing trade routes like the Strait of Hormuz, and deterring major state-on-state wars.
And Auchincloss is arguing that this architecture, built by the nation that saved the world from the Nazis, has now been replaced by a dynamic where adversaries like Iran, Pakistan, and China are the ones dictating the terms of surrender and controlling the narrative.
But Auchincloss doesn't just offer a grim autopsy of the situation. He outlines a completely different, proactive vision for regional security. He calls it a greater Mediterranean alliance. He argues that focusing narrowly on just Israel versus Hezbollah or just America versus Iran misses the broader geopolitical picture.
He proposes a three-pillar strategy to stabilize the region without relying on the old, collapsing security umbrella. What is the first pillar?
The first pillar involves reinforcing and expanding the Abraham Accords.
The Abraham Accords were the series of joint normalization statements initially between Israel, the United Arab Emirates, and Bahrain, right?
Yes, a diplomatic breakthrough that normalized relations between Israel and several Arab states. Auchincloss wants to take those diplomatic accords and build a hard power framework on top of them. Specifically, he proposes integrating a unified air defense substructure across all those nations.
Explain how an integrated air defense system actually works across multiple sovereign borders.
It requires massive technological and intelligence sharing. Instead of Israel, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia each having their own isolated radar systems looking for Iranian missiles, they network their systems together.
Oh, I see.
A radar in the UAE detects a launch, instantly feeds that data to a command center, which then calculates the trajectory and tasks an interceptor battery in Jordan or Israel to shoot it down. It creates a seamless, cooperative, multi-layered shield against Iranian ballistic missiles and drones.
Which means those Arab nations no longer have to rely solely on the United States to shoot down the threats. They create their own localized deterrence. That's a massive structural shift. What is the second pillar?
The second pillar is highly economic and directly addresses the vulnerabilities we discussed earlier. He advocates for massive investment in the India-Middle East economic corridor.
This is a fascinating concept. The goal here is to create new logistical infrastructure, massive deep-water ports in India and the UAE, connected by high-speed rail networks traversing the Arabian Peninsula, linking up to pipelines that flow into the Mediterranean and straight to Europe.
And the strategic brilliance of this corridor, from a geopolitical standpoint, is that it completely bypasses the Strait of Hormuz.
It makes the geography irrelevant. If Iran controls the strait and tries to charge a $2 million extortion fee per ship, this economic corridor provides a physical alternative. You unload the cargo in the UAE, put it on a train across Saudi Arabia, and bypass the choke point entirely. It fundamentally neutralizes Iran's geographical leverage over global supply chains.
It is a massive structural solution to a geographical vulnerability. However, the logistics and funding required to build high-speed rail and pipelines across hundreds of miles of desert involve trillions of dollars and years of sustained international cooperation. It's a generational project, not a quick fix.
But it changes the map. And what is the third pillar of his strategy?
The third pillar is to strengthen NATO and tie NATO and the Abraham Accords more closely together. He envisions creating a unified arc of allied cooperation stretching from Ukraine in Eastern Europe all the way down through the Mediterranean and into the Middle East.
Serving as a massive interlinked bulwark against hostility from both Russia in the north and Iran in the south.
And crucially, Auchincloss argues that securing this Mediterranean arc and building this regional resilience is absolutely necessary to free up United States resources. He argues the U.S. cannot remain bogged down trying to micromanage Middle Eastern conflicts. They need to secure the region so they can pivot their focus to address what he identifies as the true pacing adversary of the 21st century, China, in the Indo-Pacific region.
So that is his grand geopolitical strategy. But having a grand strategy means nothing if you don't have the political power to implement it. Auchincloss also outlines a specific domestic political playbook for how to counter the current administration from a minority position and stop the unilateral implementation of things like the 10-point plan.
He details a four-step political strategy. First, driving wedges into the opposing partisan coalition, what the source refers to as the Magie coalition. He wants to highlight the internal contradictions of their policies to fracture their base of support. Second, actively empowering and amplifying dissenters from within the administration itself, finding the career diplomats or military officials who oppose the capitulation and giving them a platform.
Third, rallying outside groups, bringing in industry leaders who are terrified of the shipping costs, academic institutions, and civil society groups to build a broad coalition of opposition.
And fourth, using the combined momentum from those first three steps to force actual binding congressional action. Specifically, his ultimate goal is passing a new targeted war powers resolution. This resolution would legally demand a 2/3 vote in the Senate for any agreement, framework, or treaty the president attempts to ink with Iran.
He wants to legally box in the president's unilateral authority to conduct war and peace by reinforcing the constitutional checks and balances we discussed earlier. And as we look at his strategy for driving wedges into the administration's base of support, there is a massive contradiction that Auchincloss highlights to execute this.
It is a striking irony.
Oh.
The current administration ran heavily and won on an America First, quasi-isolationist foreign policy platform. They promised to disentangle the U.S. from foreign conflicts.
Yeah.
Yet, according to the source material, the same administration has bombed 7 different countries in its first year in office.
And further, in a moment of deep economic irony, the source notes that the administration recently had to ask China, their primary geopolitical rival, for help in lowering domestic gas prices for American consumers.
The political argument Auchincloss is making to the opposing coalition is essentially, look at the actions, not the campaign slogans. Bombing multiple countries while simultaneously relying on your primary global adversary to manage your own domestic economy does not align with the promised isolationist America First vision. It looks like chaotic entanglement. He's using their own actions to fracture their political support.
It is a masterclass in political maneuvering, aiming to translate domestic division into foreign policy restraint. It has been a massive amount of information to process today. We have traced a line from a stalled hotel room in Islamabad, through the narrow shipping lanes of the Strait of Hormuz, across the collapsing security architecture of the Middle East, and straight into the deadlocked, recess-taking halls of the U.S. Congress. We are looking at a scenario where a superpower is allegedly capitulating to extreme demands, abandoning its historical allies, and watching global supply chains become vulnerable to extortion. Meanwhile, its domestic legislature is paralyzed by partisanship, with some members actively defending the erosion of their own constitutional war powers, while others try to architect a complex political and diplomatic counteroffensive from the minority position.
The scale of the institutional stress, both globally and domestically, is profound. It tests the very limits of the systems designed to maintain order. And observing the entirety of the breakdown described in this source material, it leaves us with a critical, overarching question to consider. When a nation's domestic political polarization becomes so extreme that it completely paralyzes its own legislature during an active global crisis, does that fundamentally rewrite the rules of global security forever? Does the world simply move on and build new structures without them?
It is a chilling question, and it really gets to the core of how domestic dysfunction broadcasts weakness onto the international stage, inviting adversaries to rewrite the map. It is something for all of you to seriously mull over. We want to warmly thank you, the listener, for staying with us until the end of this extensive analysis. Navigating this kind of complex, charged material isn't easy, but your curiosity is what makes this show possible. Please be sure to subscribe to